Let's talk about scope. What is scope, why do we need it, and how can it help us write less error-prone code? Scope simply allows us to know where we have access to our variables. It shows us the accessibility of variables, functions, and objects in some particular part of the code. Why would we want to limit the visibility of variables and not have everything available everywhere in our code? Firstly, it provides us with some level of security to our code. In a moment, I'm going to show you a picture and then it's going to make more sense. And secondly, it helps us to improve efficiency, track bugs, and reduce them. It also solves the problem of naming variables. We have three types of scope: global scope, local scope, sometimes also considered a function scope, and a block scope, only with let and const variables. Variables defined inside a function scope are in a local scope, while variables defined outside of a function are in a global scope. Each function, when invoked, creates a new scope. There are rules about how scope works, but usually you can search for the closest opening curly brace and closing curly brace around where you define the variable. That block of code is its scope. All of this might be confusing until you see some examples. You're going to immediately understand what a scope is. Let's explore it in code. Inside of here, I have opened a new folder inside of Visual Studio Code. I named it 06 Tricky Concepts. And as usual, we have the index.html and the script.js file connected to that index.html. You can right click it, open it with live server, and then we can have the console running on the left side and our code here on the right side. Amazing. So what is so-called global scope? When you start writing in any JavaScript document, you're immediately in the global scope. Right here, if I was to write something, const name is equal to John, for example, this variable here is written inside of a global scope, and it can be accessed by any other scope. What do I mean by that? Well, if we create a new function, const log name, and it's going to be an arrow function, inside of there, if we want to console.log that name, just like this, we are going to be able to do it. Now, let's do a function call log name, just so we can see the output of the function, and let's save it. Now, as you can see on the right side, we do get John. That means that we have access to the name variable inside of the log name function. As you can see, the name variable is defined right there on global scope, and we have access to it anywhere and also in the log name function. Great. So what are some advantages of using global variables? You can access the global variable from all the functions or modules in your program. It is usually used for storing constants as it helps you with the consistency. For example, if you everywhere have the same variable, then you declare it here and you can reuse it all across your file. Also, a global variable is useful when multiple functions are accessing the same data. For example, if we had a function called log name2, and then in there, we also want to console log the name. Now, it wouldn't make sense to create two different name variables, like const name is equal to John, just like that, right? With this, we have to declare the variable here and also here. But if we have just one declared in the global scope, then we can reuse it in both of these functions. Great. These are the advantages of using the global scope. Now, let's talk about the disadvantages. If we declare too many variables in the global scope, they remain in the memory till program execution is completed. This can cause the out-of-memory issue, but generally it's also not considered a good practice to have everything in the global scope because it's gonna keep running until the program is over. Secondly, data can be modified by any function. Any statement written in a program can change the value of a global variable. This may give unpredictable results in multitasking environments. For example, what do I mean by that? Well, if we declare this global variable with let, now the function log name can also change the name. So we can do name equal to Jane, for example, and then it logs something. Or for example, we can console log it and then change the name. We can also console log the name here. So that's gonna be console log name. And now let's bring this function call above. If we save this, now you can see that this function altered this variable here. and that may lead to unexpected results. In here, the variable was John, but in here we changed it to Jane, and the changes still remained in the global scope. Now let's talk about the local scope. Variables defined inside a function are in the local scope. In here, we can change this to const, and as you can see, this is a global scope. But in here, I'm going to write a comment. We're gonna say local scope, or also sometimes called function scope. Inside of here, we're going to create some function. We can name it like that, some function. And that function is going to create a variable. And this here is considered the local scope. Everything from line 5 to line 7, or more precisely inside of this block of code, is considered a function or a local scope. So if we were to declare a variable right here, const name is equal to Jenny, for example, let's now comment out this global scope variable. Now, of course, we can do a console log here. Let's console log the name, and let's make a function call, some function, and just like that. As you can see, we do get Jenny. But now, what would happen if we tried to console log the name right there in the global scope? What we had before is that we had the global variable and we called it inside of a function scope. That worked. But this time we have a function variable and we are trying to call it outside, so in the global scope. If we now do that and if we save, as you can see, we get nothing. Name doesn't exist, and that's not valid. That means that we cannot use local variables outside of the scope they were declared in. Now, if we were to write another function inside of this function, so let's do another function is equal to an arrow function, and then whatever we do in here is going to be one more inner local scope. So if this thing here, let's say local scope, and then that's gonna be number 1, then this thing here inside can be local scope number 2. That means that whatever we write in here, let's write a const name is equal to John. This variable can be accessed inside of here, inside of the function it was declared in from line 5 to line 17, but it can also be called inside of the inner function. So if we test it out and save it, you can see that right now, well, we don't get anything because we're console logging the thing outside and we're only calling this some other function, but let's also call the inner function just so we can get that console log. So another function, call it, and as you can see, we do get both console logs. That means that the variables you declare above can be used below, but not vice versa. What do I mean by that? Well, if we now declare this variable in the second local scope, and we try console logging it above in the above scope, and if we now again call both functions, you can see we get nothing. We cannot access this variable. If you hover over it, it even says that name is declared, but its value is never read. This picture nicely represents what's happening. We have the outer function and we also have the inner function. As you can see, we can see from the inside to the outside. That means that we can access the outer variables from the inside. But if we try to access the variables from the inside from the outside, that's not gonna work because in here we have something called a one-way glass. So you need to know, if you want to use something in multiple functions, you need to bring it above to the point where every function has access to it. Great. If this topic is still confusing to you, just make sure to write some code, write some functions, declare some variables, play with console logs, just so you can get a better feeling of how it all works. Scope is one of the fundamental topics of any programming language. So let's talk about some advantages of using local variables. The use of local variables offers a guarantee that values of variables will remain intact while the task is running. You can give local variables the same name in different functions because they are only recognized by the function they are declared in. That means that if we want to create a variable called name, let's now delete this inner function. So if we want to create a variable called name in here and do John, and then if we have another function, so const another function, In here, we can also have the variable with the same name, const name equal to Johnny, for example. Now, if we try console logging both names, we should indeed get two different names and no error. That's because we declared them in completely different functions in completely different scopes. As you can see, once we call both of them, we do get John and Johnny. If you had just one global variable, this wouldn't work. Also, local variables are deleted as soon as any function is over and release the memory space which it occupies. That means that when this function is over with doing whatever it's supposed to do, then the memory for keeping this variable is out, and that makes our code more efficient, opposed to having the variables outside, they always keep running. So what would be some disadvantages? And the disadvantage is that they have a very limited scope. For example, now if you wanted to console log the variable from the sum function outside, you wouldn't be able to do it because the scope is limited only to this function. This isn't necessarily a disadvantage, but if you ever find yourself needing to use that variable in a parent scope, just declare it there. That's it. So if you ever need to do this, just bring this variable above and you should be fine. We talked about the global scope and the local scope. Now let's talk about the block scope. Does block scope have any differences to local scope and the global scope? Well, let's say that we have a simple if statement. The condition doesn't really matter, but let's say that we have just true here. That means that it's always going to be executed. Now, you can see this is similar to the function, right? We have the curly braces, which mean that we have a block of code. Variables defined with const and let have something called a block scope. That means that they will be available only inside of the block of the code you create them in. For example, if we create a variable const name is equal to, let's do John again. If we do this, and if we try console logging it here, of course, as we learned, we have the access to the variable since it was defined in this scope. But now, can we do console log name right here, inside of the global scope, not inside of this block scope? Let's try it out. As you can see, we do not have access to it. That means that it behaves really similarly to the local scope or the function scope. As you can see, any variable we declare in some sort of a block, like a function or if statement or a for statement, we do not have access to it outside of that actual block. That's not the case with var variables though. As you can see, if we do var name equal John, and if we do this, we do get John. And that's a problem. That's the exact reason why people stop using var and transferred over to let and const. So what is more useful? The local and global variables are equally important while writing a program in any language. However, a large number of the variables may occupy a huge memory. Also, global variables are tough to identify, because later we may have files with 150, 200, 500 lines of code, and then when you're using that variable on line 250, you always need to scroll back to the top to see where it was actually declared. Therefore, it is advisable to avoid declaring unwanted global variables. Always declare variables in the scope that you want to use them in.